January is often celebrated as Sanctity of Life Month in some places around the world. And I think this idea that human life is sacred is an important theme that we need as the people of God to consider. I want to read for you as we begin our time together Genesis chapter 1, a section of Genesis chapter 1, verses 24 to 28. Today, we're not going to cover the subject adequately. As I sat down to prepare this brief message, I was overwhelmed with the idea that there's just not enough time to cover it all. And so I'd like us to take a few moments to consider the principles behind this issue of the sacred, the sacred substance of human life. And I want those principles to move us into action. At the end of this time, I want us to have a burden to move forward, to step out in faith so that we can become the agents of God's grace that He intends us to be in the world. So let's begin with Genesis chapter 1, verses 24 to 28. And this will set us up well to consider the sanctity of human life. Hear the word of the Lord. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let him rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created humanity in His own image. In the image of God, He created him. Male and female, He created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the air, and over every living creature that moves along the ground." The word of the Lord. Let's begin our discussion about the sanctity of human life by recognizing that all life matters to God, not just human life. In Psalm 24, verse 1, we find out that the earth is the Lord's and everything that lives in it. He has made it. The seas and the land, the creatures that fly in the air, the creatures that crawl along the ground, the creatures that graze in the field, and the creatures that swim in the sea. They all matter to God because they belong to Him and they are His creation. In fact, we read in Genesis chapter 1 that humanity's commission was to have dominion over the earth, to be caretakers over the earth as God's image in creation. We also see in Proverbs 12, verse 10, that a righteous man cares for the needs of his animals. And as we bring the book of Jonah to a close, as we finish reading those verses, we find that not only was God concerned for the people, but also the livestock He mentions, as He's questioning Jonah about his concern over the city. He says, "Should I not care about all these people?" And that's not even to mention the livestock that live in the city. All life matters to God. It is His. And we are going to be held to account for how we have managed this world. Again, the commission was to have dominion over it, to be God's image in creation, God's special representatives over the earth. All life matters to God. But human life matters to God in a special way. And we see that coming through I'm going to present three passages early in the Bible, in Genesis itself, that should show us just how distinctly God thinks about human life. The first we've already read. It was in Genesis chapter 1. So God created mankind, humanity, in His own image. In the image of God, He created them. Male and female, He created them. We are created in the image of God. No other creature can say that about themselves. We are God's image in creation. That comes with both responsibility and priority of place, a special place within creation. I think it's also important then, as we hear that we are created in the image of God, that we turn to Genesis chapter 5 and read the first few verses here. Genesis chapter 5, verses 1 to 3 say this. This is written, the account of Adam's line. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. He created the male and female and blessed them. And when they were created, he called them Adam, or man. When Adam lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, and he named him Seth. So not only has God created us in his image and blessed us and given us a commission, but we see now as humanity, even though they have fallen in Genesis chapter 3, they continue to transmit that image through the generations. Not only is Adam and not only is Eve created in the image of God, but they, as they have children, pass that image. The likeness of Adam is found in his son Seth. We all have been given the image of God. We are the image of God in creation. And if we turn just a few more pages in Genesis, to Genesis chapter 9, the flood has occurred. The earth has been wiped clean. And now creation is being restored. God says this to Noah. And for your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal and from each man too. I will demand an accounting for the life of his fellow man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made man. You see, humanity is special in creation. Yes, all life matters to God, but humanity in particular matters to God. It is because we believe what we believe that we believe human life is sacred. It is because of what God has said about us that we believe human life is sacred. So it should not surprise us that others who do not believe these things would disagree with us on the value of human life. In fact, sometimes when they stand up and say that these lives matter, that humanity matters, they are actually acting inconsistently with their own worldview. But we as Bible-believing Christians open the book of Genesis. We hear what God has said about us, that we are made in his image, that that image is passed from one to the next. All humanity receives as our birthright that image of God. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 17 to the end of the chapter. Let me read for you what it says here. Remember that Israel is receiving the law from God. This is what holiness looks like in the community of Israel as my people. Deuteronomy 24, verses 17 to 22. Do not deprive the alien or the fatherless of justice, or take the cloak of the widow as a pledge. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you there. That is why I command you to do this. When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back and get it. Leave it for the alien, the fatherless, the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, don't go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest grapes from your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this. Did you hear it over and over again? The alien or the foreigner, the fatherless and the widow. The poor are given special place in Scripture. They are brought to the front, and those who are rich and powerful are often absolutely blasted by God and his prophets for the way they treat the poor. The common denominator, let me give you three things as we think about identity. Where is the sanctity of human life being threatened? I think these three ideas show us clearly where human life is at risk of losing its sacred place that it ought to have. First, these are the disconnected. The alien, the fatherless, and the widow. They are disconnected. There are relationships that we often rely on to bear us up and to carry us along. There is a disconnect. Second, there is the disadvantaged. Often rights are not extended to these people, or they are not in a place where they can use their rights. There's a lot of talk about human rights today, but let's recognize not all men are treated equal, even if they are created equal. Some people are disadvantaged. There are the disconnected, there are the disadvantaged, and then there are the vulnerable. Those who have no one to defend them. Those who do not have the means to defend themselves. Doesn't this catch what is being preached in Deuteronomy chapter 24? The foreigner, the fatherless, the widow, they are disconnected, disadvantaged, and vulnerable. That's why when we talk about the sanctity of human life, the unborn are at the front of the conversation. They are disconnected. Those little lives yet emerging into the world, still growing in their mother's wombs. They have become disconnected from the parents who ought to have provided the home and the place for them. And we recognize those parents are often under extreme stress, social pressures, a variety of issues. And yet what we recognize is that the unborn are disconnected from those closest relationships sometimes. Those relationships that ought to nurture and bring vitality to their lives are sometimes the very ones who are making the decisions to end those lives. They are disconnected. They are disadvantaged. In many ways, our world has worked to help us see the unborn as not really humans at all, people at all. Again, there is a huge backstory to this. There is a context. But let's recognize that not all the rights extended to you and I have been extended to those who are in the womb. And finally, the vulnerable. They cannot defend themselves, and they need someone else to speak. They have no voice. And so we talked about the sanctity of human life. We recognize that God has created in these little ones a creature made in his image. If we will not defend them, who will? That's why the sanctity of human life this month is often celebrated as an opportunity for us to remember the value of those little lives. But I think it's also important that we recognize these categories, the disconnected, the disadvantaged, and the vulnerable. They're not unique to the pro-life movement or this idea of sanctity of human life for the unborn. Who in your circle is disconnected, disadvantaged, vulnerable? I live in Canada anyhow, wherever you live, and there's a multitude of social systems in place, a network to help people when they struggle and are in need. And I think for us as citizens in Canada, it's often disengaged us from the needs of the disconnected, the disadvantaged, and the vulnerable. The church needs to be the champion of these people. So I ask you today, as we think about moving, as we think about action, who in your circle is disconnected? Who in your circle is disadvantaged? Who in your circle is vulnerable? How is God calling you to meet the needs of the alien, the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow? Are there immigrants in your community? Immigration policy is a complex issue. Not all immigration policies are bad. Not all immigration policies are good. But I do know this, that when you move from one place to another, when you geographically relocate, very often there is a disconnect that occurs, and many of your relationships are lost. Many of the relationships you needed, many of the relationships we count on to thrive. Who in your community is disconnected. I will stand here and tell you, as one who has moved around a bit, having lived in Southern Ontario, Northern Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, the value, the preciousness of having people who will connect with you when you have become the alien and the foreigner. Who is disconnected? Where is God calling you to action? How about the disadvantaged? How is God calling you to stand in the place of those who are at a disadvantage? Maybe it's the choices they've made. And yes, we do reap what we sow. But God is calling us to show mercy, even as He's shown us mercy. Remember, we once lived as enemies of God, and He has shown us grace. How do we now extend that grace? Maybe the disadvantages come because of their choices. This is an opportunity to share the gospel into that situation. Maybe those who are disadvantaged have been born into that disadvantage. How can we, by the grace of God, reach out and share the richness we've received with those who have not been blessed as we have? You have a responsibility to use well what God has given you. How can your advantage be leveraged to love and care for the disadvantaged? And finally, the vulnerable. Will you stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves? Will you give a voice to those who have no voice of their own? Are you willing to be the defender of the weak, or are you going to passively stand by while they are used and abused by those with power? It will happen. It is happening. Now, I want to quickly say here, not every fight can be fought by every Christian. God is not calling you to take the world on by yourself, but what He is doing is He's calling us to step out in faith as He opens the doors for that. And so that's why I ask you today, where in your circle, where in your heart has God laid something on your heart? Don't be passive. Don't leave it aside. Don't wait for someone else to act. Now let's talk about the means by which we fight, because it is important we get this right. Very often, Christians have stood up and said and done very foolish things with the best of intentions. We have actually, in the end, wounded when we ought to have been healing. I can remember having preached a message with the best intentions in the world, and having found out later that the words I used with such indelicacy, with such a lack of sensitivity, were more than likely strokes of a blade to a heart I didn't see and understand. And I remember I regret that message so much. It was the best of intentions, but it was spoken in ignorance. How do we fight? Well, in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 to 12, Paul says this: Finally, be strong in the Lord and in His mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh or blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against heavenly realms. Against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Better get that right. So here are the two principles I want you to keep in mind. First, we fight by caring for those who need mercy. We've already talked about this, right? John says that Jesus comes into the world. God demonstrates His love by sending His Son into the world as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. This is love, not that we loved God, but that He loved us and sent His Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. And then He immediately follows that up by saying, so brothers, we also ought to love one another. If God has loved us that much, we also need to love one another. And that's the command, wasn't it, in Deuteronomy chapter 24? That we ought to love those who are vulnerable, those who are disadvantaged, love those who are disconnected. Do that. We cannot afford to be passive. We are not obedient to Christ if we are passive. Jesus says, follow me. Didn't He do that? Didn't He love the tax collectors? Didn't He love the poor women, the rejected women, the abused women? Didn't He love the lepers and the children? Didn't He love the men who are so lost directionless? Wasn't he the one who has paved the way for us in this aspect? We begin the fight by loving those in need of mercy. That is how we fight. But we also fight by graciously loving those who oppose us. Remember, Jesus said, you've heard it said that you should love your friends and hate your enemies, right? But I say to you, love your enemies. That's what Jesus commanded us to do. Pray for those who persecute us. And we do it knowing that those who oppose us are themselves slaves. Paul said, we don't fight against the flesh and the blood. We fight against the rulers and authorities, against the powers of this dark world. We fight against the spiritual forces of evil. That person standing across from you is held captive. They are a prisoner. They are blind to the light of the gospel and God's grace. So love them even as you oppose them. Recognize they need grace. As I said, this idea of the sanctity of human life is such a big issue, but it is a central issue to what we are called to as Christians. May God open the door for you. May you step through that door by his grace, given courage and strength, because the Spirit of God is alive in us and at work through us. May you be blessed as we follow in obedience together.